Can I just, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes for questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I beg your forgiveness and the forgiveness of the witnesses because I'm going to go on a little bit of a tirade for just a minute. One of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seemed somewhat surprised, chagrined, that Merck has filed suit against the so-called negotiation process that they set up. When that bill first came into this body, into this committee, this subcommittee 3 years ago, on first blush, I raised the issue that when you take between 65 and 95% of the total sales of a medication, it is on its face unconstitutional and would likely face a challenge in the courts. I raised it again in full committee. I raised it on the floor, and for 3 years, every time it came up, I raised it, and it was included in the IRA. And to say today that you're somehow surprised took me by surprise. Because my thought is, of course Merck sued, and every drug manufacturer probably ought to sue because it is on its face an unconstitutional taking. All right, now to the questions I actually had prepared. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses. In my district, a company had a contract facilitated by HHS to produce nitrile butadiene rubber, the main ingredient in disposable gloves, as well as the finished gloves. They were directed by the federal government officials to submit 2 separate proposals to both the Department of Defense and the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, or ASPR. They were assured that this was for process reasons and funds would be available for them to complete the contract, which included new construction to expand their production capabilities. So, the county donated hundreds of acres of land valued at over $17 million, and the Commonwealth of Virginia provided tens of millions of dollars worth of incentives. Since then, the company has only received partial funding and has had to halt construction, and my district is left with hundreds of acres unused and a half-built manufacturing facility. This was largely due, in part, to a lack in communications between ASPR and the Department of Defense, and a lack of transparency. Now, in the flow chart, this is mostly for folks back home, I know y'all know this, but in the flow chart of responsibility, both the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, and the Strategic National Stockpile, SNS, are directly under ASPR. Accordingly, I have 2 bills in front of us this hearing that will provide structure around contract duration as well as require a 90-day notification requirement to vendors in the case of any modifications, renewals, extensions, or terminations of contracts with the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority and the Strategic National Stockpile. It's my understanding this contract notice requirement is already required for contracts under the SNS's Special Reserve Fund. Dr. Parker, can you please explain what processes are in place currently within ASPR to notify companies of any modification or changes to their existing contracts?
Well, I'm not currently in ASPR or federal government. It's been a while, but what you just described sounds like a reasonable thing to have in place. That, it just increasing the transparency with the private sector, with those who are doing business with the government. It's a two-way street between the private sector and the federal funding agency.
And it's along the same line, but can you explain why providing more stability and certainty for companies when contracting with ASPR, BARDA, SNS would be beneficial for both taxpayers and also the company who initially receives the contract? And I probably already answered it in my description of what happened in my district, but go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with the case in your district, but that sounds very, very unfortunate and sounds like a huge communication issue. But I do think that speaks to the issue of the fragmentation between the federal the interagency, in this case DOD and HHS. So that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and we're going to try to fix that. And to go back and harp some more, it wasn't just me. There were others who came forward on the situation with the drug pricing so-called negotiations. When you put a gun to somebody's head, it's not really a negotiation. And even the Congressional Research Service came out with a statement that they thought it was not only an unconstitutional taking, was possibly, because they're never going to commit to the final result of the court, but not only was it possibly an unlawful taking, but it was also probably in violation of the excessive fine prohibitions that are found elsewhere in the first 10 amendments of the United States Constitution. And interestingly, Merck has also sued because there's a regulation or a rule that's come out. You're not supposed to talk about how unfair it is. And you could even lose your rights to sell other medicines to the federal government, all of which seems atrocious, and I expect the courts to knock it down, and I'm shocked that anybody would not understand there's at least a huge argument to be made in the courts. I yield back.